Hi, I'm Jim from the Old Warlock. This is Alexander, and today we're going to be looking at a little bit of D&D history. In particular, we're going to be examining probably the most important book related to Dungeons & Dragons that you have never heard of, and that is the Holmes Basic book that came out in 1977. Now, prior to 1977, the Dungeons & Dragons books looked something like this. In fact, if you go back a little bit earlier, you'll find something called chainmail. And chainmail was actually a supplement for people who played tabletop wargaming. And these are just kind of an intermediate step, just a few paces beyond that tabletop wargaming. There are a set of several of these. And unless you were a tabletop wargamer, and when I talk about tabletop wargames, think of Warhammer. Warhammer is the direct descendant of tabletop wargaming. But unless you did tabletop gaming back in the 1970s, 1960s, you might have had a difficult time understanding the rules as they were laid out in these books. So about 1976, a man by the name of John Eric Holmes came along, and he had gone out and purchased these books. I mean, I really like this guy. I've never met him, but I think he's a really great guy because he was one of those dads who went out and purchased these books because he thought his kids might enjoy playing. And the thing is, he was a bright enough guy to where he could easily decipher the rules, but he realized that for the average person to come in and get involved in what he thought was one of the greatest games ever developed, it would be kind of a leap for some people to really find a way to understand the game. So he approached TSR and Gary Gygax and asked if he could rewrite the rules into a basic rule book that could be sold to the masses, as it were. And this was the book that he came up with. Now, the first edition of this particular manual came out in 1977. It was available at one of the cons that year. This one came out in 1978 as part of the basic set. And really what this does is it boils down all of the rules in these, and there are a number of other books similar in size to this that were all part of a set. I don't have them. If anybody has any they're willing to part with, let me know. But he took all of those earlier rules and he boiled it down into this one particular booklet. Now, this is basic Dungeons and Dragons, and this is how I learned to play. I bought this in 1978, and I've never looked back. And a lot of the things that we do when we play, even today, you can pull some of the things directly out of this book. You can point to some of the things directly in this book to say this is where our current homebrew game got its start. Now, in the basic rules, it only allows you to go first through third level, but everything that you need to get started in Dungeons and Dragons is right here. Inside of this book, there are all kinds of great things. This is where I first had my introduction to the treasures and the monsters that you can find in Dungeons & Dragons. A lot of these monsters are still being used in 5th edition D&D. One of the fun things for me, though, was going in and finding that there was a sample dungeon inside of it. And it's something that still exists in my campaign, and if you go to the right place, you can still go through this dungeon. So, how is that relevant to today, other than being an interesting bit of history? Well, there are some folks, a man by the name of Michael Thomas and some other folks got together and turned out a book that is really kind of a tribute to the original Holmes Basic book. It's called the Blue Home Prentice Rules. You can see the link through the name there that he's giving, like I said, a kind of a tribute to John Eric Holmes. And this book is essentially a very slight rewrite of this original Dungeons & Dragons manual. And to be perfectly honest, I think if you were interested in Dungeons & Dragons, you haven't actually gone out and purchased all the books, the 5th edition things, 3rd edition, whatever you want, wherever you're thinking about going and playing, even AD&D, which is what we play primarily. This is actually an excellent place to start. If you look at the rule books that Wizards of the Coast are asking you to go and purchase, you can walk away with a stack of books this thick. But for just a few dollars, you could actually go out, buy the Blue Home Prentice Rules, and you're looking at a grand total of, say, 50, 55, 56 pages that will help you get started in Dungeons and Dragons. And out of those 56 pages, a lot of those are just the monsters and treasures and things. The actual rules for play actually take up quite a bit less than that. So if you're thinking about Dungeons and Dragons, if you know some people who have heard about it, you're not quite sure what it is, I strongly recommend this Blue Home Apprentice Rules, which is a very, very slightly rewritten version of this original game by John Eric Holmes. If you find that you enjoy Dungeons and Dragons, there is another set that's put out by the same group that put out the Blue Home Apprentice Rules. It's called the Blue Home Journeyman Rules, and it just expands upon the original Dungeons and Dragons laid out here in this book that takes you in version 1 through 3.
So one of the biggest problems that we've come across that people have had on message boards and things like that, as well as people that I know, people my age who want to try and get started playing D&D, with the 5th edition stuff that Wizards of the Coast puts out now, there are huge amounts of resources, materials, books, supplements, everything that you could ever imagine that they're releasing, and it's difficult to know sometimes where to start, how to kind of get it going, especially if you don't know anybody who plays, you're in a big group of people who all want to learn how to play at the same time, something like that. And with this daunting overproduction of books exclusively for the purpose of making money, mind you, it can be difficult to find something to get started. So there are starter sets for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I don't like them because the rule books included within them, you can find them for free online, are still very complex. This in general just goes back to the fact that 5th edition is more complicated to understand than AD&D. But if you really want to find something that's a good sort of just starter introductory thing, these books are the way to go, because the game is simpler. It's easier to understand. Everything you could possibly need is here, and there's never any, since it's essentially a reprint, slight rewrite of something released in the 1970s, there's no desire for the people releasing it for you to then use that as a jumping off point to then go and buy 5 other books and saying, well, if you want to learn more about this, then buy whatever supplement we have.
Well, and they do have the one supplement, but it's just one. I mean, you're right. They have the one. It's just for more advanced rules, but it's just another book.
Yeah.
I think that they do have. I think that this particular company also, they make modules and things like that. If you're interested in doing that, but really to play the game, this is all you need to get started. And this retails for $7 to $10.
Yeah.
Whereas the D&D 5th edition starter sets, they can run from 10 to 20 or so. But this is really pretty much it. And it also goes back to some of the things that we've talked about in other videos, where we prefer this style of D&D. This is straight out from the beginning of Dungeons and Dragons, just when it was starting to get its feet under it. And they make mention in here, when you start, you're going to have a character that's going to die, and you're going to keep playing characters that die until you finally find that one that sticks, as opposed to the 5th edition things that we disagree with, where it's primarily you start as a hero and all your entire job is just to maintain that heroic status. With these rules, starting back with these rules, you started off with essentially a kind of a slightly above average person, and then you had to make your way up to heroic status. So that's another reason why I really like this. But I also just like it because this is if you hear people talking about wanting to play old school style, this is how you're going to learn how to do it in this Blue Home Apprentice Rules book.
And it's a lot cheaper than trying to hunt down AD&D players' handbooks and DM's guides, because I know from personal experience those can be incredibly expensive and hard to get a hold of. So this is a great alternative for until you know that's something you want to make an investment in. This is a great way to test the waters and not end up spending $300-400 on books straight out of the gate.
But going back to the history and why I think that this is probably the most important book that's ever been created for Dungeons and Dragons, this is really the book that started it all. And this wasn't even written by Gary Gygax or Dave Arneson or anybody else. This was written by Eric Holmes. And if it wasn't for, I personally believe that if it wasn't for the existence of this book, Dungeons and Dragons would never have caught on like it did in the 1970s and 1980s. Because prior to that, it was all this. Gary Gygax was working on the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons manuals at about the time that this was actually published. But without this book to lead the way into AD&D items, I don't know that AD&D would have caught on in nearly the same way. Like I said, I started playing this with this book in 1978. I can remember being surprised and finding it in the 1980s when I was living in the United Kingdom. There were people over there playing it. We had someone from France who had a French language version of it, as I recall, as well. So this is the one that really paved the way for Dungeons and Dragons to start spreading around the world and to become the game that really it's become today as far as popularity. And if this had not existed, it's hard to tell if Dungeons and Dragons would have survived in the early 1980s or the mid 1980s into the 90s. So anyway, that's all we really wanted to talk about today, unless you have something else.
No, I'm done.
Most important Dungeons and Dragons book that you've never heard of, the Holmes Basic edition here. You can get it with just some minor modifications to make it a little bit more readable from these folks, the Blue Home Apprentice rules. You can pick it up pretty much anywhere for about $10. Really good jumping off point for getting into Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, you can get some direct from the people who sell it, or you can also find some on eBay, Amazon, and I think Abe Books also has a couple. So go buy it.
And one last cool thing that I'm just going to point out, because that's the kind of stuff that I really like. If you look at these two covers, one of the really cool things is that they took the dragon from the original cover and they managed to put his head right here in the middle of the later version. So to me, again, I mean, it's also just kind of a neat thing that they were willing to give credit where credit is due in terms of the name, the artwork, things like that. I like the company. Go buy their product if you're thinking about getting into D&D. Anyway, I'm Jim. This is Alex from the Old Warlock. Thanks for stopping by. Keep your sword on free.
Bye.